to the heart of why you would want a DEI effort at the fire department. At the end of the day, the most important thing, as is the case whenever you have any kind of intervention like this, is that qualified people are there and that everyone has a fair shake at a high quality job, that no one is underqualified or unqualified for the job. In terms of the fire, which is your first question, I don't think that DEI has anything to do with these fires. I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and a lot of it has to do with Democrats, Democratic mayor, Democratic governor, Democratic councils. I mean, there's a lot of criticism to go around. There's a lot of targets here, but DEI to me isn't the issue here. I'm more concerned with how the police were overfunded and fire departments were underfunded. I'm interested in climate change and having that conversation. We have to have a conversation about the kind of homes we have and the kind of homes we build these days. There are lots of things to talk about, but I don't think DEI is the blame here. Okay,
Gillian, you lost a home in a previous fire in LA in 2018. You've had to evacuate your own mother in these fires. I've got to say, my place is in Beverly Hills, which thankfully has not been hit yet, although the next 48 hours will be pretty crucial, I think, as to what happens, because the Santa Ana winds are going to come back with a vengeance, we're told. And if they head northeast, as they did a couple of days ago, and they jump the 405 freeway, then everyone in Los Angeles knows what that means for Bel Air, Beverly Hills, and potentially everywhere else in the city. So these are pretty scary times for everyone who has a property there. What do you feel? I mean, as someone who's watched this play out before and suffered a horrible loss yourself, what do you feel about the blame game, the accountability part?
Well, I think that leadership in California is absolutely accountable for this. They are the ones who are in charge of mitigating these kinds of disasters. And I want to play complete devil's advocate here. Let's go with, we do know that California is prone to wildfires. Santa Ana winds, we all know this. And I'm not a climate change expert here, but if we play that card, and I'm more than happy to do it, you should have been that much more prepared. And we know for a fact that if we were doing prescribed controlled burns, forestry cleanup, creating fire breaks, if we had the reservoir filled that was uphill from the Palisades, the one closest to the Palisades, we probably could have put that fire out more effectively by getting it done sooner rather than days later. If you manage the state's water more efficiently, and there are so many issues with that, considering how many billions of gallons go to growing shelled nuts. It's like 80% of the state's water, which is 2% of the state's GDP. If you reprioritized where you're putting the state's budget instead of giving homeless people drug kits and maybe invested in desalination plants, I mean, there are so many things that we can talk about in this episode that are grossly negligent and would have had a massive impact on saving lives and saving people's homes.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling, Michael, I'll bring you in here, is having had a home in LA for 15 years and lived and worked there for 20 years, this issue of the fires has been ever present. I mean, the big fear has always been another big earthquake. But everyone's been very aware that there's been a lot of fires and they seem to have been getting more prevalent, not less prevalent. And everyone's been like, well, what's being done to protect everybody? And there was perhaps a false complacency that stuff was being done that meant this stuff we're seeing now couldn't have happened. But it has. And yet, as I say that, I'm mindful of a clip of Joe Rogan that's doing the rounds on social media, which is from last summer, in which he talks about a previous conversation he had with a firefighter. Let's take a listen. Now, I mean, Michael, very prescient there. So people can't claim they didn't think this might happen. Literally, Joe Rogan, the biggest podcaster of the world, is openly telling everybody what a firefighter told him was likely to happen. And that was a few months ago. What is your take on what you think has really been behind all this?
Well, I think that in terms of what actually caused this fire, we're still trying to figure that out. But it's clear that LA is a city that's built in a fire zone. Wildfires are endemic to the land. And we need to take that into account with the way that we govern this city and the way that we budget for emergency services and fire prevention. And I think that the city leaders do need to be held accountable for managing and preventing fires in a realistic way. We only spent $42 million per year on fire prevention. And I think we need to talk about how that budget is being allocated compared to other other spending, like billions of dollars going to policing and the repairs on a reservoir that should have taken a week have taken more than a year. I think that those types of things absolutely should be coming under the magnifying glass. But I think that the point that Joe Rogan made in that clip is right, that this type of thing is going to happen. It's impossible to prevent fire devastation in the city of LA, but we can definitely mitigate it, and we need to be doing a really good job at mitigating it. And I think that this fire is showing that there are some gaps in our plan. It's really tragic.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute tragedy. And there is an argument, Amala, that no one could have done anything to stop something quite like this, because it's been a freakish set of circumstances of a Santa Ana wind, which anyone, as I say, if you live in LA long enough, you know all about the Santa Anas. They come like the Mistrals in France, and when they come, you wake up and a lot of howling wind, and your garden's covered in crap, and we're all used to it. What's different here is the winds were at 100 miles an hour. That's hurricane force winds, and it coupled with a fire. And when you have 100 mile an hour winds blowing across a city with a fire, it's a perfect hellish storm. So let me preface this by saying, it may be nothing could have stopped this from doing what it did. However, I think you have a view, contrary to what Mark said, that DEI and wokeness have played a part in the failures here. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we're going to learn in the days to come about these fires. As Jillian and I believe Mark mentioned, we're still waiting to see the cause of a lot of these fires. It's totally understandable to me that this is what happens in LA, that we can pretty much imagine that this is going to occur to some extent. But we can also see a department that has, in my opinion, wasted time and resources on these woke agenda pieces like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where could that time and where could those resources have gone? What could they have been allocated to when it comes to response to these fires? Not only that, I'm seeing reports on social media, I don't know about anybody else, of arsonists, looters, and this is sort of a culture that we've created here in Los Angeles, here in California, with the way that we've been soft on crime, with the different policies that we've pushed forward. So honestly, I think we're at this moment of just waiting for information. But as Jillian said, you can also see that reservoir that held what should have been 117 million gallons of water was not working. The brush cleanup that should have been happening for decades was not happening. You have Rick Caruso here in Los Angeles, who was running for leadership. He managed to save his land, his properties, and he did so through proper planning and being proactive. So what could we have done in this city? Probably a lot.
Yeah. I mean, Mark Lamont Hill, I saw you shaking your head there, but I'm not quite sure what you're shaking your head about. Because anyone who's lived in LA, like I said, it's been clear. Two things have been clear. Newsom has had a lot of rhetoric about being tough on crime and sorting out the homeless problem and so on. And the complete reverse has happened. Even in Beverly Hills, where I live, and I go to lots of other parts of the city when I'm in LA, but even in Beverly Hills, the degree of homelessness, the degree of crime, violent crime involving guns, right in the middle of Beverly Hills at lunchtime, shootouts in restaurants and things, that never used to happen, I can tell you. It was never like it is now. So there's no doubt to my mind that when Amala says what she said there about issues like the crime increasing and so on, it's indisputable. If you live there, you know it.
Right. I mean, if one were not watching this video and only hearing it, they would think that I shook my head when we were talking about crime and homelessness. I didn't.
Well, you seem to.
What I shook my head.
I'm sorry.
What I shook my head to was the issue around the quote unquote woke policies and DEI policies. Right. That specifically is what I'm addressing. So we don't have to guess. I'm telling you what it was. The idea that there's some relationship between the fires and the department's investment in DEI policies. Even Amala herself has said, we're going to find out if that's the case. But why are we beginning from a premise that is the case? Is anything possible? Sure, but there's no evidence of it. Also, the idea of calling it a wasted effort to me is a bit bizarre. As I'm sure you know, or maybe you don't, I'm talking to the audience, not you two in particular, the department had a significant problem with sexual harassment. The department had a significant problem with racial discrimination. It's acknowledged that. The department had multiple firefighters sue. The department acknowledged that they were overrepresented by white men and underrepresented by other groups. And to be clear, that's a statistical analysis. That's not a subjective assessment. It's not a moral judgment. I'm saying they're overrepresented demographically. So in light of that, my question would be, if you don't think they need needed an inclusion or equity initiative, how should they have responded? This is to Amala. How should they have responded to the proven cases of discrimination, sexism, and harassment that were happening in the department? What should they have done instead of having an initiative?
Okay, well, fair enough. Amala?
Yeah. Sure, I can answer that. Yeah, when we're looking at those cases that you've just spoken about, sure, we should hear out every single case of sexual harassment and discrimination, especially if we can prove that it's on the basis of race, or we can prove that there is ill intent within a department. Now, that's not what's being articulated by the LAFD. They are saying that they are looking specifically for people of certain races, of particular gender backgrounds, and we should be moving towards a race-neutral future. If you want people to be judged on the content of their character, of their abilities, their intelligence, their strength, which is very important when it comes to the fire department, you should do exactly that. It has nothing to do with whether or not you're a woman. It has nothing to do with your race. And as we saw that assistant fire chief state, she's speaking about diversity, equity, and inclusion through a lens of wanting people who look like her to be in the department, wanting to be able to show up to houses of California residents that apparently look like her so she can serve them better. And she's not really speaking to her capabilities. As she even stated in her own video, she'd be incapable of carrying a man out of a fire. So your articulation of diversity, equity, inclusion is very different from what we're getting. And let's not forget that diversity, equity, and inclusion is based out of critical race theory, which is fundamentally flawed. If we truly want race neutrality and people to be judged based off of their abilities, we should do exactly that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, Mark, I'll come back to you quick.
So you said three things
hang on, Mark.
true
I'll come back to you for a quick response, and I go to Gillian. But Mark, it's come at the same week that we saw Mark Zuckerberg basically ending all of Meta's DEI programs, along with a complete reversal of everything else you could call woke policy. I mean, it seems to me that the wind is blowing. Well, I won't use that phrase because there's obviously a much bigger, more problematic wind blowing. But there is a change in direction from companies that you would say were very liberal skewed, like Meta and others, to just get rid of all DEI programs because they've concluded, and you may have a view about this, that they actually they are wrong. They promote mediocrity. They're not meritocratic in the way that companies should be, in my view. And it's happening quite fast now since the big Trump win over Kamala Harris, who represented all this woke stuff to her bootstraps. What's your response to that?
Well, I think you're right to say that corporate investment in DEI was always cynical. They never cared about diversity, equity, or inclusion. They did it because it was popular. After the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd, it was popular to say you were down with DEI, so they did it. And a lot of those companies never actually even turned in the money. They never actually followed up on the promises that they made. And now that it's no longer popular, they're pulling back. Corporate America does what's good for business, not what's good for people. But I reject your claim that DEI is not meritocratic or it undermines meritocracy. The data contradicts that. The decades of studies contradict that. I also reject Amala's claim that the fire department was doing something systemic in response to something that was individual. She said they should have adjudicated those cases, but not gone on this big initiative to have different hiring practices. I think maybe what you missed was the complaints themselves were about a systemic failure to hire qualified black people, to hire qualified women. So again, when you talk about DEI, it's not about getting unqualified black and brown and women in a room of qualified white men. It's about saying there's 10 qualified people in this room. The first 6 we've hired have been white men. Maybe the next 4 shouldn't be when demographically there's enough black people here or enough women or whomever.
But hang on, but that's exactly the point, which is when it comes to firefighting, actually, no. Sorry, I just want the best people for the job. Sorry, I do. If I'm a homeowner in LA, I don't care what colour they are, what sexuality they are, what gender they are.
May I ask you a question about that, Piers?
Hang on, Mark. I don't care about any of it. I just care, are they the best available people to save me from a fire? End.
You're misrepresenting the issue, though. No one is saying that the best qualified people shouldn't be hired. The issue is, again, there are 10 people in a room.
Yeah.
They're going to hire 8 of them. The first 6 they've hired have been white men.
Yeah.
Of the remaining people, there are qualified white men and qualified black men and
Yeah.
qualified black women. The issue historically in that department has been, even when the women have been qualified, even when the black men have been qualified, they still have not gotten hired. It's not that black people have gotten not hired and they're unqualified. It's they've been qualified and not hired. And so they're trying to respond to that by being intentional about saying, hey, let's bring in some qualified black people to augment the qualified white men as well. So no one wants an unqualified firefighter. You know what I mean? No one wants an unqualified surgeon. But if you keep not hiring qualified black people, we got to do something about it.
Okay, let me bring Gillian in because obviously the LA mayor, Karen Bass, is a black woman. I've got to say, of all the people in officialdom that I've seen since this disaster started, she seems to me to be the most woefully incompetent. One, when it started, there had already been warnings that there may be a big fire issue coming. And she gets on a plane and she goes all the way to Africa to the inauguration of the new president of Ghana. Now, this is someone who the New York Times has established 2 years ago, actually said on the record while campaigning to be mayor, not only would I, of course, live here, but I wouldn't travel internationally. The only places I would go would be DC, Sacramento, San Francisco, and New York in relation to Los Angeles. And yet there she is at the inauguration of an African president while her city's burning. And when she came back, she was jumped by a very good journalist from Sky News here in the UK, David Blevins. And the response was pathetic. Let's take a look. I mean, I'm sorry, Gillian, that was just so pathetic, wasn't it? I mean, she's the mayor of Los Angeles. Say something.
It's absolutely outrageous. And again, I can't speak to the DEI component because I don't really know the history of who they did or didn't hire. I'm currently under the impression that the fire chief wanted more bodies, no matter what color, what gender, or what sexual orientation. And if I'm wrong about that, please educate me. With that said, Karen Bass is incompetent. I don't care if it's because she's a woman of color. She's just flat out incompetent. When your fire chief writes you a letter in December of 2024, after all of northern Malibu has just burned down again, and says, do not cut my budget, it will be a catastrophe, you don't cut the budget. I'm absolutely outraged and disgusted. It is gross negligence, period. And then you have nothing to say when you're questioned about it. What are you doing in Ghana? You are a local, you're a mayor. You're not an ambassador.
That's
you
ridiculous.
don't work for the federal government. What is going on?
Yeah,
I mean, we could point to so many of these things. It's just outrageous.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think she's been completely incompetent and exposed as incompetent. In fact, all her public utterances make me cringe. Let me bring Michael back in here.
Completely.
I mean, I want to play a clip, Michael. This is from the fire department chief, Kristen Crowley, who, as things stand,